Thank you for joining our second Six by Six virtual social. For those of you who haven't joined us before, we're 6 photographers who came together to produce 6 weekly exhibitions and social gatherings for debate around photography in the cafe bar Ropes and Twines in Liverpool city centre. As we're now forced into these virtual gatherings, we aim to continue showing work and expanding the conversations around documentary photography in its broader sense. We are, and please give us a wave, Adam Lee, Tig Devlin, Colin McPherson, Steve McCoy, me, Stephanie Wynne, and last but not least, Craig Easton, who this evening is going to present one of his recent projects, Fisherwomen. Craig, also a friend, but an exceptional multi-award winning photographer with over 25 years of experience working in both photojournalism and advertising. I would describe Craig's work ethic as relentless. In addition to commission work, he always has a few personal projects keeping him busy. Over the last couple of years, he brought together a collective of photographers to create and produce the 16 project and touring exhibition, whilst continuing with projects in Blackpool, Bolton, and discussing tonight his other project, Fisherwomen. So, before I hand over to Craig, if anyone has any questions, please post them while he's talking, and Adam will open up discussion at the end. Right, so but one more thing. Craig always defines himself as a Scotsman, and I have yet to detect it in his accent. So everybody, really listen carefully. Okay, Craig, it's over to you.
Oh, well, thank you, Stephanie. And thanks to the rest of the 6x6 colleagues who put a lot of effort and a lot of work into organising these shows and the evenings we put together at Ropes and Twines. I'm gonna move straight on actually, because we want to get through some stuff tonight. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me just work out how to do that. Okay, so is that all right? Does everyone can see that? Adam, can you see that?
Yeah, that's perfect, Craig.
Lovely. Okay, well, thank you. Good evening, folks. Thanks for joining us. I think it's actually good afternoon for some people, because I think there's people joining us from the US and from Canada. Might actually even be some, I've heard rumors that there's real live fisherwomen joining us from the great state of Alaska. So if you're in Alaska, good morning. And thank you for coming. It's kind of weird to know where everyone is in this sort of strangely connected or disconnected world. But a special welcome really to any fisherwomen that are listening. I might feel a wee bit under pressure, but I hope that you'll find the work I'm going to show tonight does justice to the great tradition of women working in fishing and celebrates really the work that they do. I'm well aware, of course, that as a photographer, my job is to photograph people working. It's other people that do the real graft. So I hope what I do honours that. And then just before I start, I do want to give a quick shout out to a great Instagram account that celebrates the role of women in fishing called @StrengthOfTheTides. They also use the hers also hashtag from a phrase, the seas are hers also. So if you can check that out, please do. It's really interesting. It's mostly US based, I think, but don't hold that against them. So this is me. I'm going to talk about Fisherwomen tonight, but before I do, I'm going to give you a little bit of background about my own work in case any of you don't know that I started out in newspapers as a working photojournalist, and unlike Colin McPherson of 6x6, we both started at the Independent, and I was working in London whilst he was in Edinburgh. So we didn't actually meet until much later on. And whilst in recent years I've moved away from daily news, much of my work is still concerned with similar issues really that I was photographing then, and the things that made me a photographer in the first place, exploring social issues and inequality and societal concerns. But now I work on longer term projects and more than single pictures. And I'm one of those photographers that that tends to sort of have multiple projects on the go all at the same time, as Steph mentioned. And I think some people focus on one project and work on it for a long time and then move on. I tend to dip in and out of projects, and they evolve over time. And a lot of them are interrelated, of course, and there's a lot of crossover, but broadly they fit into two camps. There's social issues, really, is such as this was the 16 project. Again, Steph mentioned this. And this is something that I've run with a group of photographers over the last couple of years, exploring notions of meritocracy and social mobility and dreams and aspirations and fears of 16-year-olds. Or there's another project called Thatcher's Children, which follows on from the previous picture I just showed you, that looks at sort of the intergenerational nature of poverty and how it's been experienced by one family over 28 years. This is a brand new piece of work that I'm doing at the moment, a project called Think, which deals with the question of how we organize society. Sort of big questions, really, and I suppose particularly relevant, I imagine, in the coming months and years. But then there's the other side, the other strand of my work, and that's equally important to me, and perhaps can be considered the sort of softer side of storytelling. It's less politics, more personal. And that includes projects like this, The Lake, which is a very personal piece of work about where I go for headspace. And Dreich. And Dreich is a I could probably say it in a Scottish accent, because it's my grandmother used to use the word Dreich all the time in Edinburgh when I was growing up. And it's an old Scottish word, which is still in use today, but it means that sort of dank, grey, incessant, wet weather. And people say they don't go to Scotland for the weather, but I do. And that's what this is all about. And that's a sort of celebration of terrible weather. And I suppose to some extent Fisherwomen fits into that category. It's kind of more of a celebration of the role of women in fishing rather than hardcore photojournalism. You know, we hear sometimes, don't we, that a lot of people think of the idea of defining yourself or your life by your job is the bad thing, that we should be more rounded than that. But I kind of think, you know, rounded or not, I'm afraid I do define myself as a photographer. It really is who I am, not just what I do. And as such, I photograph all things that interest me, how I respond to things, like, you know, to the news, to politics, to things that make me angry, but also to things that bring me joy or fascinate me, or I just find visually interesting. And, you know, just on that point, I really think that there's nothing wrong with making beautiful pictures. There seems to be sometimes an aversion to that in contemporary photography circles, an almost anti-aesthetic, and I just don't get it. You know, I need beauty in my life, and I need it in my life and in my work just as much as I need to address social concerns. And of course, beauty doesn't mean pretty sunsets and wildflowers. It really means honesty and truth and seeing splendor wherever you can. And it doesn't need to be conventional. I often read a book Robert Adams wrote called Beauty in Photography. And it's a sort of philosophical collection of essays about these kind of things. So that's enough about me, the background. This is, I'm going to talk, as I said, particularly about Fisherwomen tonight. And I'm going to jump around a little bit and talk about how it came about and how it developed. So bear with me, because I'm going to go right back to the beginning, the roots of the project, just to talk through how these things evolve. And I've worked extensively in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. I used to work with Rick Stein. He's a TV chef here in the UK, famous for his fish cooking. And I used to work with him going back 20 years. I did a lot of books with him, and I worked in a lot of fishing communities. And I knew the stories of the herring girls. I don't know if you know about the herring girls, but they're a critical part of this project, and I'll refer to them later on. But this is just kind of how it was all brewing in my mind. I read a book by Neil Gunn called Silver Darlings, and that was set in Caithness in the early 19th century. And I knew the work of Winslow Homer. Now, Homer's a fascinating character, really. He's an American painter, and he pitched up mid-career in this tiny Northumberland fishing village called Cullercoats, just outside Newcastle. And he arrived in 1881 and stayed for a couple of years, really. And a fishing colony, a sort of artists' colony, grew up around that area. And all the artists seemed to be fascinated by fisherwomen. And he made this work in Cullercoats that absolutely transformed his painting and his career. After that, his subject matter became sort of more real, more documentary. And of course, he went on then really to become the father of American modernism. So he's been a real inspiration for this, but there's also other painters. I'm just going to show you a couple of these. This is Robert Jobling, also working out of Newcastle. His wife, Isa Jobling. John Charlton. This is women pulling in the boats at Cullercoats. And then the last couple in Fife, there's a painter called John McGee, who made a series of well-known and much-loved paintings of fisherwomen. So all this was in my mind, and you know, in many of these fishing villages that I was visiting around the coast, they have these little museums, and in the museums they have lots of black and white postcards of fisherwomen. Hundreds and hundreds of them, sort of up to their elbows in guts and surrounded by barrels on the quayside. So this is Lerwick in Shetland, which we'll come back to. Fraserburgh, all these names are places that will come through as I talk about my work now. Great Yarmouth, 1920, and Lowestoft. And so that's the background. That's what I was kind of working from. That's where I came from. And I knew these pictures, and I was thinking about it, and a thought occurred to me one day, well, so who's doing that work now? So what I did is I knocked on some doors, and these were the first pictures I made. This is back in 2013. This started, and I very definitely chose not to make them as reportage pictures. I wanted the focus to be on the women themselves. You know, I wanted to show them laughing, and I wanted to capture the sort of character and the pride that they had in their work. So these are the early ones. And so this is, I suppose these were a couple of years I was doing this on and off, 2013, 2014. And then I just left it on the back burner for a while. I was still shooting them. I did a few in 2015, but I wasn't really sure where I was going with them. And I knew they worked as pictures, but I wasn't really sure that I was getting across the full story that I wanted to tell. And always in the back of my mind was these older representations of fisherwomen, the artists and the early photographers. And at the same time, a realization that photography of fishing in recent years had almost exclusively been of fishermen, the heroic blokes going out to sea. And I'm thinking of Herbert List and Jean Gomy and Salgado and Nick Hedges in the Northeast. And that's when the idea of the journey came to me, and the older women, making that connection between the contemporary experience and the long heritage and tradition. So this was probably, I guess this was 2016 now, and I finally came to the idea of using a route map as a vehicle to explore the work further. And that kind of helped define the project. It gave me a framework. And I decided to split the project into three parts. There was these contemporary portraits, and then there's what I'm calling heritage, which is looking at the tradition and the journey. And so this is the route that I settled on. And the reason I looked at this is because the herring industry, particularly in Scotland, but also in England in the 1800s, was enormous. I mean, I think it was the second or third most important industry in Scotland. And the herring is a migratory fish, and it arrives in Shetland, right up in the north, in about May, late May, early June each year. And then as the shoals migrate south, of course, the the fishing fleet would follow them. And this is, you know, before the days of you know, big factory ships and processing out at sea and all that kind of things. So these were day boats, and they'd go out overnight, and they'd bring the catch in the morning. And of course it needed to be processed or gutted and packed or salt pickled every day. So as they followed the shoals, they would bring the catch into these different ports down the East Coast. I mean, there was a West Coast herring fishery as well, but I followed the East Coast just because it was a kind of nice linear route. Although I am doing some work, I think I'm going to be doing some work in the Western Isles, maybe in the Isle of Man as well. So whilst the fishermen were doing this, the women would mirror their journey, and they would travel on land, stopping in all these ports, and they would gut and pack the fish every day. So they made the same route. So these two journeys were going down the East Coast at the same time every year, and did this every year for 150, nearly 200 years. And so once I decided on this as a route, I started kind of to research a bit more diligently. And that's when I started looking at the early work of two Scottish photographers, David Octavius Hill and Robert Adamson. And I was aware of their work, of course, but it was through conversations with the head of photography at St Andrews University Special Collections that really allowed me to examine this work much more closely. And what struck me was that really, by any estimation, these pictures were the first social documentary photographs ever made anywhere in the world. I mean, we're talking about 1843, 1845, and you know, and photography had only been invented in well, I know we've got some French people listening this evening. There may be a battle between us when it was invented and who invented it, but certainly in England in 1839 was the first time the calotype process was invented. And there are good reasons why there was a lot of experimental photography happening in Scotland. But what interested me about this is that they were the first social documents, but they weren't necessarily only made for the reasons of social documentary as we know it today. It was, you know, these women were well-known characters in their traditional costumes, and they'd be recognizable to the Edinburgh middle classes that would visit the seaside towns and the beaches. And so it was almost certainly a commercial decision that Hill and Adamson made. They would reckon on selling these prints. And they were the first time that photographs of working people had been made in the places where they lived and worked. And they were made with some social concerns. I mean, you know, as I was looking into this, you know, this is, like I say, the 1840s, so it's kind of 90 to 100 years after the start of the Highland clearances, where you know, the rural communities in Scotland were forced off the land, and there was mass migration to the cities, and it was after the Enlightenment and policies of laissez-faire economics and the free market, the early free market with Adam Smith, and it led to terrible poverty and overcrowding and deprivation. And New Haven, it seems, represented an alternative to that. It was an idyll where people could lead decent lives and live off the land, well, in this case, off the sea. So there was that aspect to it too, and it was a reaction to the hardships and the suffering that Hill and Adamson would see in Edinburgh that made them go to these things as well. So that's kind of all of the background. These are the very early calotype photographs that I saw at St Andrews University. I was terribly privileged to be able to see these. These were made in the 1840s. And what I love about this is you know, but for the plastic aprons and rubber boots, you know, she could be in 1840, really. They're pretty much the same thing. So I started making these longer journeys and meeting some of the older women, and I was recording interviews with them and collecting photographs they gave me. So they gave me pictures like this. This is Barra in the Western Isles. And then this is one that was given to me in Lerwick in Shetland. And these are the very last barrels ever to be packed. And this was 1974. Because the trade had boomed, the herring trade had boomed in the 1800s, and then again in the 1920s and the 1950s after the World Wars, which had allowed fish stocks to replenish. But by the mid-60s, it was dwindling again. And then when mechanization came in, the fish stocks plummeted. and a moratorium was imposed in 1974. So the industry never really came back, but that's kind of the whole of the background, a sort of potted history of how the whole thing came together. And now we're going to start with, these are the landscape part of the project, what I call Journey. And so I start here in Muckleflugger, which is the northernmost point in the UK, right at the north of the island of Easton, Shetland. And the reason I start there is it's a kind of obvious starting point, and I travel all the way south from there. Some of the pictures are literal representations of the fisherwomen's story. Some are more evocative of the landscape. This is the remains of Gutter's huts in Balta Sound in Unst, and so Balta Sound. I mean, Unst is this tiny, the most northerly inhabited island in the UK, and there's, I don't know, there's maybe 400 or 500 or 600 people live there now. It's not very big. But back in the day, at the height of the herring trade, 6,000 women would come every May to gut the fish. And so this picture here, this is the footings of the huts that they used to live in. And the village of Balta Sound is behind me. I mean, it amounts to, 3 or 4 houses, well, a few more than that. But, and that piece of water you can see there is the Balta Sound. So all the way around that water are these footings of houses where the huts used to be, where the women used to stay and cook and live, and they would gut the fish on the shoreline there. And they'd say that you used to be able to walk from one side of the sound to the other across the boats. There was that many boats that used to come in. So these pictures sort of follow that route south. This is Shetland mainland. Featherland's a half fishing station. This wasn't particularly a place where women worked, but it's more kind of representational of the sort of fishing communities and the kind of wider landscape that would have been familiar to the fishing communities and the places that the fisherwomen came from. Esher in the west coast of Shetland mainland. And one of the things I wanted to do with the journey or the landscape pictures was to visually reconnect the places that were once so familiar to all these communities. Not only to the fishermen and the fisherwomen, but also to the wider communities because of the annual visits. Fraserburgh folk knew the Hessel Road in Hull, and Yarmouth people would know Shetlanders. They had friends and they'd tell stories, and the connections between these places were tangible. They knew the landscapes that each other came from. Even now, if you go to Walsey in Shetland now, even now you'll hear talk of Lowestoft, and it feels kind of incongruous being so far away from each other. But I wanted to use these landscapes really to remake that connection for the audiences in the exhibition, so that when they saw pictures of Yarmouth fisherwomen, they would understand the relationship with Shetland. This is Stronsay in Orkney. So Stronsay is one of the Orkney Isles and is the sort of major herring port. It was always the major herring port in Orkney. And then travelling south, this is, it seems odd to say travelling south because Dunnet Head is the most northerly point on the British mainland. But as you come from Shetland and Orkney south, this is the first piece of the Scottish mainland you see, Dunnet Head Lighthouse. And just around the corner in Wick, Wick's a lovely little place way up near John O'Groats, and there's part of Wick, there's the old part of Wick that exists, and then there's a place called Pulteney Town, which was designed by Thomas Telford, and that's where this herring mart is. And interestingly, both Wick and Balta Sound in Unst were both colloquially known as Herringopolis back in the day because it was so important. And then this is a homage to Homer, really. Homage, I don't know, is it a homage to Homer or an homage to Homer? I don't know. And this is the beach. This is the beach on which he made those paintings in the 1880s. And so some of the landscape images, as I say, have this literal connection to the fisherwomen's story, and some are depictions of the landscape to help the audience understand. And then this is a reference to the earlier representations of fisherwomen. Traveling south again, this is Hull. This is the Bullnose in Hull, which is the entrance to the fishing harbour, the last piece of land that the fishermen would see when they went out to sea, and the first piece of land they'd see when they came back. And that has a connection. This is a mural in Hull about Lil Balocka. I don't know whether people know about Lil Balocka, but she's a legendary figure in the whole fishing industry. She wasn't a fisherwoman herself. She was, I think she was the wife of a trawler skipper, as I recall. But in the 1960s, she battled and battled and battled for safety measures to be introduced onto the trawlers. This was after a great tragedy when 3 trawlers went down in Hull in the space of 3 or 4 weeks in the early 60s. And in fact, a friend of mine, Brian Lavery, has written a fabulous book about this called The Headscarf Revolutionaries, which is worth checking out if you get a chance. And then down towards the end of the journey, this is the last smokehouse in Yarmouth. Great Yarmouth used to be absolutely filled with smokehouses. There was, well, I don't know if there was hundreds of them, but there was probably 100. And so around town, you still see these buildings with these kind of chimneys, odd chimneys coming out the top. And this was the very last one that closed very recently. And then things like this. I found this in a garden. I just saw this in a garden. So I knocked on the door, and a guy called Jack Hobbs, an old man, had made it as a memorial to his father, who was a skipper of a herring drifter in the 1920s, 1930s. And it kind of speaks of how culturally ingrained the herring is in the collective memory of these communities. And then the last one, Lowestoft, these are the net drying posts at Lowestoft. And they're kind of just left there. It's bizarre, kids play there and people walk their dogs, but obviously back in the day, this would have been an enormous thriving industry. So that's the journey, which was all shot in black and white. And no, we may be getting questions saying, why did I shoot in black and white? The answer is I don't know. Probably just wanted to. And then this is the second part of the project. This is what I'm kind of loosely calling heritage, but it's really just looking at the tradition, the long tradition of women working in fishing. And this is Mary Williamson in Walsey in Shetland. And as I said, there was a real boom in the herring industry after the Second World War. And so many of the women I photographed first started as herring girls in the 1940s and 1950s. So they're all in their 80s and 90s now, of course. And they used to travel 3 to a crew. So there would be 2 gutters and 1 packer. And so I caption each one with their job titles. And it's interesting, there was never, ever any crossover. You were either a gutter or a packer. And still now they'll tell you, oh, Ruby's a gutter and Agnes is a packer. And they say was. They don't say, they say is, they don't say was. It's present. Once you're a gutter, you're always a gutter, I think. A few more of these. This is Rita. Rita's from Glasgow. She had a great story. So I do these interviews with them, and I've got these audio recordings. And I think it's important to have those, really, because although I'm a photographer, it does feel a little bit like a kind of social history that I'm recording. So in the exhibitions, we use some of the audio as well. Rita came originally from Glasgow, and she went to Shetland and out to the Isle of Man. And she met her husband in the Isle of Man, Jim. He was a cooper, and Jim's mother was a fisherwoman, and Jim's grandmother was a fisherwoman, and his dad was a cooper, and it's absolutely ingrained in the family. So Jim and Rita travelled to Lowestoft, like many of the crews, and they ended up staying there for years and years afterwards, eventually going back to Shetland, and they set up a smokehouse in the 1970s, early 80s maybe. And one of the wonderful things about this project is that I'd meet people like Edna. And I was really pleased to find Edna because she's the last of the surviving fisher lassies who stayed in Yarmouth. I mean, many of the Scottish girls did, of course, stay because they married and settled there, but a lot of them have passed away now. And some went back to their original homes in later life, but Edna was the one that I found, and she was still alive and still in East Anglia. and she has lovely quotes in her conversations with me, and about the warmth of the weather and how it compared to her upbringing in Fraserburgh. And then halfway through, I don't know, the second or third conversation with her, completely out of the blue, I discovered that she was Rita's sister-in-law. And that's how tight-knit these communities are, that, you know, that they were at the opposite end of the countries, but they were sisters-in-law. So it was lovely. It was a lovely connection. I was able to carry news back from one to the other. Agnes Bowie, originally from Wolsey in Shetland, now in Lochinver in Sutherland. So I was doing these portraits. These are all shot on, mostly all shot on large format 10:8 film. And I'd have these wonderful interviews that went with them. And at the same time, people would give me these old photographs, and you know, so I'm kind of collecting this work, and I'm trying to, then you're working out how it's going to translate into something you can exhibit or publish. And of course, when you're curious and you go and see people, extraordinary things happen. So this is a copy of a memoir that was shown to me by a lady called Nana Pierce in Stronsay. And I went to see her in July 2018. And it happened to be my birthday. And by chance, it was Nana's birthday as well. And she was 99 years old. So we shared some tea and some cake. And she showed me this. This is a handwritten memoir called Looking Back to 1935 in Stronsay. I don't know if you can read that. I can probably read just a couple of lines to you. It's because it's lovely. She says, looking back to 1935 brings back memories to us older generation of the splendid summers when the herring fishing was booming in Stronsay. No lovelier sight was ever seen than the herring drifters coming in with their catch of herring on a calm sea in the mornings. Then the horse-drawn lorries going to the different curing stations, where the gutter girls stood at the farlings, dressed in their oilskin aprons, ready to start the day's work. No grumblers there, believe me, and to walk past them would be to hear singing while you work, the gutting knives flashing in time to the music. So it's lovely. So I've got copies of this book, and I'm in touch with them. So I don't know what'll happen about that, but I show these in the exhibition sometimes because it just brings things alive. This is shown as a big print in the exhibitions. This is Ruby Poulsen in Wolsey showed me this. This is a wonderful sort of handwritten record of every catch that was landed in Simbister and Lerwick between 1957 and 1961. And so again, I show this in the exhibition. You can read all these things, and it gives you a sense of how important the fishing was to the community. And then finally, for the heritage aspect of the project, I made these hand studies of some of the women, and I present these in the exhibitions as a set of 4 called the hands that gut the herring. And I mean, they're obviously a little different to the other work in the project, and it's a fine balance really between telling the whole story but keeping it visually interesting whilst not having too many different things going on. So so I don't really include these pictures. These pictures aren't included in the publication we're just doing at the moment. But this image comes, there's an artist's edition, and this one comes as a 12:16 print in the exhibition as opposed to in the book itself. A couple of others of the hand studies, and obviously there's some kind of token reference to Paul Strand's work in South Uist going on here. I suppose it'll be subconscious connection, but something that I wasn't necessarily overtly thinking about at the time. But all of these references of the history of photography are, I suppose, in the back of my mind. And then finally the contemporary portraits. These are these are shot as, again, down the same routes. This is Paulina in Stromness in Orkney. And what's interesting about Paulina is she's from Latvia, I think, and it kind of speaks to the fact that this is still a migratory trade. It always was a migratory trade, and there are Latvians and Estonians and Hungarians and Filipinos working there. And I show these pictures to the older women now, and they just fall about laughing, of course. They look at the health and safety and just think it's completely mad. But this is a cooked, they're making cooked crab in this place, so they have to be very careful. I mean, not everywhere is like that, you know. In Kirkwall, there's Phyllis in Kirkwall, so she's working a small family firm, still in the way that they always did. Carly, it is an industrial smokehouse in Hull, and it contrasts really with the Arbroath Smokies smokehouses in Angus. And it's interesting, this one, because these are actually in the wrong order, because that one was shot first, and you'll have noticed that a lot of these pictures, they're kind of a typology. There's mostly a white background. Sometimes I put a white backdrop up, and sometimes I've just found somewhere with a white background. And here, the wall was terribly messy, so I put the white backdrop up. But I obviously wanted to have the smoke in the picture because it's critical to it. And then I tried that on this previous one as well, but it kind of didn't work. And so I shot it just with the smoke. And in a sense, that then freed me up to be less kind of constricted by the idea of the white background, and it would allow me to do these kind of things, just find a bit of wall. A couple shot in the meantime. And one of the lovely things really about the whole project was telling the women in the factories about the history, about the great heritage that they were part of. And very often they didn't know these stories. You know, the similarities were still there. They were still full of life. They were still raucous. And, you know, I felt like I was taking my life in my hands sometimes going into these places, because they would rib me relentlessly as I was setting up the camera. But what's lovely is they're still sort of super proud of the work that they do. This is Dawn in Hull, and I mean, Dawn was just fabulous. I'll quickly tell you a story about Dawn, because I photographed Dawn. I was actually photographing somewhere else. This is a small place. There's only her and this lady called Carla that was working out. I was photographing Carla, and Dawn was, you know, rabbiting away in the background and refusing to have her picture taken. And I was saying, "Come on, Dawn, you're going to take part," and you know, and she just didn't want to do it at all. So we were talking, and as I was hearing these conversations, it was clear that she was absolutely steeped in fishing. Her father was a trawlerman and her grandmother was a net maker. And in the end, I said, "Come on, Dawn, do you want to have your picture taken? It'd be lovely." And she said, "All right, you can take my picture as long as you promise never to show me." Okay, so well, I mean, I don't need to tell you too much more about Dawn, but it was interesting that, you know, her picture was then, the Hull Maritime Museum wanted to use it on the poster, and then Radio 4 did an interview and they wanted to use her voices. So every time I had to go back to her and say, "You know, that picture you never wanted to see, is it okay to put it in the show? Is it okay to have it on the poster?" And she was great, because she really understood the importance of the project, but I still, to this day, I don't know whether she's seen the picture. Okay, so and then this is the final picture that I made. This was just made at the back end of last year, and this was an important one really, because it shows 3 generations of the same family, and that was always the case with women in fishing. That this is the grandmother and the mother and the granddaughter used to pass it on. So that's it really. So last few slides about the exhibitions. This is funny. This is 20th of April last year, so it's almost exactly a year ago since I first exhibited this work. And this is Louise, who turns up at the opening, and you know, and I love it when people see their own photographs on the walls. And you know, people ask me sometimes about why I make these big prints. So I should maybe just say that, you know, I've been thinking about portraiture, and I've been thinking about celebrity portraiture, and I'd seen these great big paintings and photographs of the great and the good at the National Gallery, the National Portrait Gallery, and you're looking up at them, and they're sort of high up on the wall, and I'm thinking about the power relationship between the viewer and the person in the image, and looking up at this great big picture. I remember it distinctly. I was looking up at this great big picture of Margaret Thatcher. And it was commanding my respect. And it won't surprise many of you to know that I don't have an awful lot of respect for Mrs. Thatcher for what she did to parts of this country. But it got me thinking about the power dynamic. And since then, I've been making these great big prints, because the people that I photographed, the fisherwomen, the working people, you know, 16-year-old Asian kids in Lancashire, I have the utmost respect. And And I want to get that across in the way I present the pictures. So I want to sort of subvert the traditional way we look at portraits and the power balance between the viewer and the viewed. So I make these prints, and they're 54 by 44 inches, and you can see the relationship there between the person looking up at them. And it's interesting to see that when you watch people look at pictures that size, they do have a different take on it. This was the show in the Maritime Museum, and there on the right you can see how the hands that got the herring are presented as a set of 4. And then finally, just a few examples from the forthcoming publication from 10 O'Clock Books. This is it's actually sitting at the printers ready to go, but obviously everything's on hold at the moment. But it's all ready to do. And we're doing it as this large portfolio style publication with big pictures printed beautifully on fine art paper, and presenting the 3 aspects of the project with some background history and some of the outtakes and interviews of the extraordinary stories. So these are just some of those spreads. That's Dawn and a transcription of her interview, which is lovely. Rita and Edna with quotes outtake quotes from their thing. Oh, this is Sheila. I mean, Sheila is brilliant. She was a trawler skipper out of North Shields in the 1970s. And there weren't many female trawler skippers in North Shields then, or anywhere then, to be honest. And her story is phenomenal. I'm not going to read you her story. You'll have to get the publication, I'm afraid. And then the journey aspect of it. And then this is the boxed artist edition that comes with a print, and really with this it's the print that people are buying. Really, it comes in a box with the publication, and we decided not to do a book that came with a wee 5x7 or a 10x8. This is a 12x16 print that's made to the same standards as the exhibition print and could be framed and hung on the wall. So obviously it's it's a very different thing, but it's much cheaper than the big 50 by 40 inch prints. And then the very last one, Rachel Nordstrom, who's the keeper of photographs at St Andrews University, wrote this lovely piece about some of the things we've talked about this evening, the shared history between photography and fisherwomen. So that's it. If you are interested, obviously I'd be delighted. 10o'clockbooks.com. Go and have a look at that if you're interested.
Thank you, Craig. It's great to see those beautiful pictures, and thanks for giving us such an insight into the multiple layers of this project. Before we leave, I'd just like to say the next 6x6 social will be in 2 weeks' time on May the 7th at 7 p.m. The photographer, Michelle Sank, will be talking to our own 6x6 Steve McCoy, discussing her work and her life in photography. Hope you can join us then. Thank you.